The Trials of Rumpole by John Mortimer. Rumpole and the Man of God. As I take up my pen during a brief and unfortunate lull in crime, taking their cue from the car workers, the villains of this city appear to have downed tools, causing a regrettable series of layoffs, redundancies, and slow-time workings down the Old Bailey. I wonder which of my most recent trials to chronicle. Sitting in chambers on a quiet Sunday morning, I never write these memories at home for fear that she who must be obeyed, my wife Hilda, should glance over my shoulder and take exception to the manner in which I have felt it right, in the strict interests of truth and accuracy, to describe domestic life à côté de chez Rumpole. Seated, as I say, in my chambers, I thought of going to the archives and consulting the mementos of some of my more notorious victories. However, when I opened the cupboard, it was bare, and I remembered that it was during my defence of a South London clergyman on a shoplifting rap that I had felt bound to expunge all traces of my past and destroy my souvenirs. It is the curse as well as the fascination of the law that lawyers get to know more than is good for them about their fellow human beings, and this truth was driven home to me during the time that I was engaged in the affair that I have called Rumpole and the Man of God. When I was called to the bar too long ago now for me to remember with any degree of comfort, I may have had high-flown ideas of a general practice of a more or less lush variety, divorcing duchesses, defending stars of stage and screen from imputations of unchastity, getting shipping companies out of scrapes. But I soon found that it's crime which not only pays moderately well, but which is also by far the greatest fun. Give me a murder on a spring morning with a decent run and a tolerably sympathetic jury, and Rumpole's happiness is complete. Like most decent advocates, I have no great taste for the law, but I flatter myself I can cross-examine a copper on his notebook, or charm the Uxbridge magistrates off their bench, or have the old darling sitting number 4 in the jury box, sighing with pity for an embezzler with 2 wives and 6 starving children. I am also, and I say it with absolutely no desire to boast, about the best man in the temple on the subject of bloodstains. There's really nothing you can tell Rumpole about blood, particularly when it's out of the body and onto the clothing in the forensic laboratory. The old head of my chambers, C.H. Whiston, now deceased, also known reluctantly to me as Daddy, being the father of Hilda Whiston, whom I married after an absent-minded proposal at an Inns of Court ball. Hilda now rules the Rumpole roost, and rejoices in the dread title of she who must be obeyed. Old C.H. Whiston, as I say, simply couldn't stand bloodstains. He even felt queasy looking at the photographs, so I started by helping him out with his criminal work, and soon won my spurs round the London Sessions, Bow Street, and the Old Bailey. By the time I was called on to defend this particular cleric, I was so well known in the Ludgate Circus Palais de Justice that many people, to my certain knowledge, called Horace Rumpole an Old Bailey hack. I am now famous for chain-smoking small cigars, and for the resulting avalanche of ash which falls down the waistcoat and smothers the watch-chain, for my habit of frequently quoting from the Oxford Book of English Verse, and for my fearlessness in front of the more savage types of circuit judge. I fix the old darlings with my glittering eye and whisper, "Down, Fido," when they grow overexcited. Picture me then, in my late 60s, well-nourished on a diet consisting largely of pub lunches, steak and kidney pud, and a cooking claret from Pomeroy's wine bar in Fleet Street, which keeps me astonishingly regular. My reputation stands very high in the remand wing of Brixton Nick, where many of my regular clients, fraudsmen, petermen, safe blowers to you, breakers in and carriers of offensive weapons, smile with everlasting hope when their solicitors breathe the magic words, "We're taking in Horace Rumpole." I remember walking through the Temple Gardens to my chambers one late September morning with the pale sun on the roses and the first golden leaves floating down on the young solicitors' clerks and their girlfriends, and I was in a moderately expansive mood. Morning was at 7, or rather round 9:45. The hillside was undoubtedly dew-pearled, God was in his heaven, and with a little luck there was a small crime or two going on somewhere in the world. As soon as I got into the clerk's department of my chambers at No. 3 Equity Court, Erskine Brown said, "Rumpole, I saw a priest going into your room." Our clerk's room was as busy as Paddington Station, with our young and energetic clerk Henry sending barristers rushing off to distant destinations. Erskine Brown, in striped shirt, double-breasted waistcoat, and what I believe are known as Chelsea boots, was propped up against the mantelpiece reading the particulars of some building claim Henry had just given him. "Ah, that's your con, Mr. Rumpole," said Henry, explaining the curious manifestation of a holy man. "Your conversion. Ha! Have you seen the light, Rumpole? Is No. 3 Equity Court your road to Damascus?" I cannot care for Erskine Brown, especially when he makes what he fondly imagines to be jokes. I chose to ignore this and go to the mantelpiece to collect my brief, where I found old Uncle Tom, T.C. Rowley, the oldest member of our chambers, who looks in because almost anything is preferable to life with his married sister in Croydon. "Oh, dear," said Uncle Tom, "a vicar in trouble. I suppose it's the choir boys again. I always think the church runs a terrible risk having choir boys. They'd be far safer with a lot of middle-aged lady sopranos." I had slid the pink tape off the brief and was getting the gist of the clerical slip-up when Miss Trant, the bright young Portia of Equity Court, if Portias now have rimmed specs and speak with a Rodine accent, said that she didn't think vicars were exactly my line of country. "Of course they're my line of country," I told her with delight. "Anyone accused of nicking half a dozen shirts is my line of country." I had gone through the brief instructions by this time. It seems that the cleric in question was called by the somewhat Arthurian name of the Reverend Mordred Skinner. He'd gone to the summer sales in Oxford Street, a scene of carnage and rapine in which no amount of gold would have persuaded Rumpole to participate, had been let off the leash in the gents' haberdashery, and later apprehended in the Hall of Food with a pile of moderately garish shirtings for which he hadn't paid. Having spent a tough 10 minutes digesting the facts of this far-from-complex matter, well, it showed no signs of becoming a state trial or House of Lords material, I set off in the general direction of my room, but on the way I was met by my old friend George Frobisher, exuding an almost audible smell of bay rum or some similar unguent. I'm not myself against a little eau de cologne on the handkerchief, but the idea of any sort of cosmetic on my friend George was like finding a bishop en travesti or saucy seaside postcards on sale in the vestry. George is an old friend and a dear good fellow, a gentle soul who stands up in court with all the confidence of a sacrificial virgin waiting for the sunrise over Stonehenge, but a dab hand at the Times crossword, and a companionable fellow for a drink after court in Pomeroy's wine bar off Fleet Street. I was surprised to see he appeared to have a new suit on, a silvery tie, and a silk bandana peeping from his top pocket. "You haven't forgotten about tonight, have you?" George asked anxiously. "We're going off for a bottle of Chateau Fleet Street in Pomeroy's." No, I'm bringing a friend to dinner with you and Hilda." I had to confess that this social engagement had slipped my mind. In any event, it seemed unlikely that anyone would wish to spend an evening with she who must be obeyed, unless they were tied to her by bonds of matrimony. But it seemed that George had invited himself some weeks before, and that he was keenly looking forward to the occasion. Oh, no Pomeroy's, then. I felt cheated of the conviviality. "No, but we might bring a bottle with us. I have a little news I'd like you and Hilda to be the first to know." He stopped then, enigmatically, and I gave a pointed sniff at the perfume-laden haze about him. "George, you haven't taken to Brilliantine by any chance?" We'll be there at 7:30. George smiled in a sheepish sort of fashion and went off whistling something that might have been mistaken for the Tennessee Waltz, if he happened to be tone-deaf. I passed on to keep my rendezvous with the Reverend Mordred Skinner. The man of God came with his sister, Miss Evelyn Skinner, a brisk woman in sensible shoes, who had foolishly let him out of her sight in the haberdashery, and Mr. Morse, a grey-haired solicitor who did a lot of work with the church commissioners, and whose idea of a thrilling trial was a gentle dispute about how many candles you can put over the high altar on the third Sunday in Lent, My client himself was a pale, timid individual who looked with watery eyes and a pinkish tinge to his nostrils as if he had caught a severe cold during his childhood and had never quite got over it. He also seemed puzzled by the mysteries of the universe, the greatest of which was the arrival of 6 shirts in the shopping bag he was carrying through the Hall of Food. I suggested that the whole thing might be explained by absent-mindedness. Those sales, I said, would induce panic in the hardiest housewife. "Would they?" Mordred stared at me. His eyes behind steel-rimmed glasses seemed strangely amused. "I must say I found the scene lively and quite entertaining." "Well, no doubt you took the shirts to the cash desk, meaning to pay for them." "There were 2 assistants behind the counter, 2 young ladies to take money from customers," he said discouragingly. "I mean, there was no need for me to take the shirts to any cash desk at all, Mr. Rumpole." I looked at the Reverend Mordred Skinner and relit the dying cheroot with some irritation. I'm used to grateful clients, cooperative clients, clients who are willing to pull their weight and put their backs to the wheel in the great cause of victory for Rumpole. The many murderers I've known, for instance, have all been touchingly eager to help, and although one draws the line at simulated madness or futile and misleading alibis, at least such efforts show that the customer has a will to win. The cleric in my armchair seemed, by contrast, determined to put every possible obstacle in my way. "I don't suppose you realize that," I told him firmly. "You're hardly an habitué of the sales, are you? I expect you wandered off looking for a cash desk, and then your mind filled with next week's sermon, or whose turn it was to do the flowers in the chancel, or the whole mundane business of shopping simply slipped your memory." "It is true," the Reverend Mordred admitted, "that I was thinking a great deal at the time of the problem of evil." "Oh, really? With the best will in the world, I didn't see how the problem of evil was going to help defence." "What puzzles the ordinary fellow is," he frowned in bewilderment. "If God is all-wise and perfectly good, why on earth did he put evil in the world?" "May I suggest an answer?" I wanted to gain the poor cleric's confidence by showing him that I had no objection to a spot of theology. "So that an ordinary fellow like me can get plenty of briefs round the Old Bailey and London sessions." Mordred considered the matter carefully and then expressed his doubts. No, I can't think that's what he had in mind." "It may seem a very trivial little case to you, Mr. Rumpole." Evelyn Skinner dragged us back from pure thought. "But it's life and death to Mordred, at which I stood, and gave them all a bit of the Rumpole mind." "A man's reputation is never trivial," I told them. "I must beg you both to take it extremely seriously. Mr. Skinner, may I ask you to address your mind to one vital question? Given the fact that there were 6 shirts in the shopping basket you were carrying, how the hell did they get there?" Mordred looked hopeless and said, "I can't tell you. I've prayed about it." "Well, you think they might have leapt off the counter by the power of prayer? I mean, something like the loaves and the fishes?" "Mr. Rumpole," Mordred smiled at me, "yours would seem to be an extremely literal faith." I thought that was a little rich, coming from a man of such painful simplicity, so I lit another small cigar and found myself gazing into the hostile and somewhat fishy eyes of his sister. "Are you suggesting, Mr. Rumpole, that my brother is guilty?" "Of course not," I assured her. "Your brother's innocent, and he'll be so until 12 commonsensical old darlings, picked at random off Newington Causeway, find him otherwise." "I rather thought a quick hearing before the magistrates with the least possible publicity." Mr. Morse showed his sad lack of experience in crime. "A quick hearing before the magistrates," I said, "is as good as pleading guilty." You think we might win this case with a jury?" I thought there was a faint flicker of interest in Mordred's pink-rimmed eyes. "Juries are like Almighty God, Mr. Skinner, totally unpredictable." So the conference wound to an end without divulging any particular answer to the charge, and I asked Mordred to apply, through his usual channels, for some sort of defence when he was next at prayer. He rewarded this suggestion with a wintry smile. My visitors left me, just as she who must be obeyed came through on the blower to remind me that George was coming to dinner and bringing a friend, and would I buy 2 pounds of cooking apples at the tube station, and would I also remember not to loiter in Pomeroy's wine bar taking any sort of pleasure. As I put the phone down, I noticed that Miss Evelyn Skinner had filtered back into my room, apparently desiring a word with Rumpole alone. She started in a tone of pity. "I don't think you quite understand, my brother." "Oh, Miss Skinner. Yes, well, I never felt totally at home with Vickers. I felt some sort of apology was in order. He's like a child in many ways. Oh, the Peter Pan of the pulpit. In a way, I'm 2 years older than Mordred. I've always had to look after him. He wouldn't have got anywhere without me, Mr. Rumpole, simply nowhere. If I hadn't been there to deal with the parish council and to say the right things to the bishop. Mordred just never thinks about himself, or what he's doing half the time." "Well, you should have kept a better eye on him in the sales." "Of course I should. I should have been watching him like a hawk every minute. I blame myself entirely." She stood there busily blaming herself, and then her brother could be heard calling her plaintively from the passage. "Oh, coming, dear." "I'm coming at once," Evelyn said briskly, and was gone. I stood looking after her, smoking a small cigar, and remembering Hilaire Belloc's sound advice to helpless children. "Always keep tight hold of nurse, for fear of finding something worse." George Frobisher brought a friend to dinner, and as I had rather suspected when I got a whiff of George's perfume in the passage, the friend was a lady, or, as I think Hilda would have preferred to call her, a woman. Now, I must make it absolutely clear that this type of conduct was totally out of character in my friend George. He had an absolutely clean record so far as women were concerned. Oh, I imagine he had a mother, and I have heard him occasionally mutter about sisters. But George had been a bachelor as long as I had known him, returning from our convivial claret in Pomeroy's to the Royal Borough Hotel, Kensington, where he had a small room, reasonable en pension terms, and coloured television after dinner in the residence lounge, seated in front of which device George would read his briefs, occasionally taking a furtive glance at some long-running serial of hospital life. Judge of my surprise, therefore, when George turned up to dinner at Casa Rumpole with a very feminine, albeit middle-aged lady indeed. Mrs. Ida Tempest, as George introduced her, came with some species of furry animal wreathed about her neck, whose eyes regarded me with a glassy stare, as I prepared to help Mrs. Tempest partially disrobe. The lady's own eyes were far from glassy, being twinkling and roguish in their expression. Mrs. Tempest had reddish hair, rather the colour of falsely glowing artificial coals on an electric fire piled on her head, what I believe is known as a Cupid's bow mouth in the trade, and the sort of complexion which makes you think that if you caught its owner a brisk slap, you would choke in the resulting cloud of white powder. Her skirt seemed too tight, and her heels too high for total comfort, but it could not be denied that Mrs. Ida Tempest was a cheerful and even a pleasant-looking person. George gazed at her throughout the evening with mingled admiration and pride. It soon became apparent that in addition to his lady friend, George had brought a plastic bag from some off-licence containing a bottle of non-vintage Moet. Such things are more often than not the harbinger of alarming news, and sure enough, as soon as the pud was on the table, George handed me the bottle, to cope with an announcement that he and Mrs. Ida Tempest were engaged to be married, clearly taking the view that this news should be a matter for congratulation. "We wanted you to be the first to know," George said proudly. Hilda smiled in a way that can only be described as brave, and further comment was postponed by the explosion of the warm Moet. I filled everyone's glasses, and Mrs. Tempest reached with enthusiasm for the booze. "Oh, I do love bubbly," she said. "I love the way it goes all tickly up the nose. Don't you, Hilda?" "We hardly get enough of it to notice." She who must be obeyed was in no celebratory mood that evening. I had noticed during the feast that she clearly was not hitting it off with Mrs. Tempest. I therefore felt it incumbent on me to address the court. Well, then, if we're all filled up, I suppose it falls to me. Accustomed as I am to public speaking, I began the speech. Usually on behalf of the criminal classes, Hilda grumbled. Yes, well, I think I know what is expected on these occasions. You mean you're like the film star's fifth husband? You know what's expected of you, but you don't know how to make it new. It appeared from her giggles and George's proud smile that Mrs. Tempest had made a joke. Hilda was not amused. Well, then, I came to the peroration. Here's to the happy couple. Here's to us, George. George and Mrs. Tempest clinked glasses and twinkled at each other. We all took a mouthful of warmish gas, after which Hilda courteously pushed the food in George's fiancée's direction. Would you care for a little more Charlotte Russe, Mrs. Tempest? Oh, Ida, please call me Ida. Well, just a teeny-weeny scraping. I don't want to lose my sylph-like figure, do I, Georgie? Otherwise you might not fancy me any more. There's no danger of that. The appalling thing was that George was looking roguish also. Of you not fancying me? Oh, I know. La Tempest simpered. I'm losing your figure, my dear. She's slim as a bluebell. Isn't she slim as a bluebell, Rumpole? George turned to me for corroboration. I answered cautiously, I suppose that depends rather on the size of the bluebell. Oh, Horace, you are terrible. Why have you been keeping this terrible man from me, George? Mrs. Tempest seemed delighted with my enigmatic reply. I hope we're going to see a lot of each other after we're married. George smiled round the table and got a small tightening of the lips from Hilda. Oh, yes, George, I'm sure that will be very nice. The tide had gone down in Mrs. Tempest's glass, and after I had topped it up, she held it to the light and said admiringly, Lovely glasses, so tasteful. Just look at that, George. Isn't that a lovely, tasteful glass? They're rejects, actually, Hilda told her, from the Army and Navy stores. What whim of Providence was it that led you across the path of my old friend George Frobisher? I felt I had to keep the conversation going. Mrs. Tempest, that is, Ida, came as a guest to the Royal Borough Hotel. George started to talk shyly of romance. You noticed me, didn't you, dear? Mrs. Tempest was clearly cast in the position of prompter. I must admit I did. And I noticed him noticing me. You know how it is with men, don't you, Hilda? Sometimes I wonder if Rumpole notices me at all. Hilda struck, I thought, an unnecessarily gloomy note. Of course I notice you, I assured her. I come home in the evenings, and there you are. There you are. I notice you all the time. As a matter of fact, we first spoke in the manageress's office, George continued with a narration, where we'd both gone to register a complaint on this question of bath-water. There's not enough to fill the valleys, I told her, let alone cover the hills. Mrs. Tempest explained gleefully to Hilda, who felt apparently that no such explanation was necessary. And George agreed with me, didn't you, George? Shall I say, we formed an alliance. Oh, we hit it off at once. We've so many interests in common. Really? I looked at Mrs. Tempest in some amazement. Apart from the basic business of keeping alive, I couldn't imagine what interests she had in common with my old friend George Frobisher. At which point Hilda rose firmly and asked George's intended if she wanted to powder her nose, which innocent question provoked a burst of giggles. Oh, you mean, do I want to spend a penny? It is customary, said Hilda with some hauteur, at this stage to leave the gentleman. Oh, you mean want a hand with washing up? Mrs. Tempest followed Hilda out, delivering her parting line to me. Not too many naughty stories now, Horace. I don't want you leading my Georgie astray. At which I swear she winked. When we were left alone with a bottle of the old tawny, George was still gazing foolishly after the vanishing Ida. Charming, he said. Isn't she charming? Now, at this point I became distinctly uneasy. I had been looking at La Belle Tempest with a feeling of déjà vu. I felt sure that I'd met her before, and not in some previous existence. And, of course, I was painfully aware of the fact that the vast majority of my social contacts are made in cells, courtrooms, and other places of not too good repute. I therefore answered cautiously, "Your Mrs. Tempest seems to have a certain amount of vivacity." "She's a very able businesswoman, too." "Is she now?" "Yes, she used to run an hotel with her first husband. Highly successful business, apparently, somewhere in Kent." I frowned. The word hotel rang a distant but distinctly audible bell. "So I thought, when we're married, of course, she might take up a small hotel again, in the West Country, perhaps." "And what about you, George? Would you give up your work at the bar and devote all your time to the Valletta?" I rather wanted to point out to him the difficulties of the situation. "Well, I don't want to boast, but I thought I might go for a circuit judgeship." George said this shyly, as though disclosing another astonishing sexual conquest. "In fact, I have applied, in some rural area." "You a judge, George?" "A judge?" "Oh, well, come to think of it, it might suit you. You never were much good in court, were you, old darling?" George looked slightly puzzled at this, but I blundered on. "It wasn't in Ramsgate, by any chance, was it? Where your inamorata kept a small hotel?" Why do you ask?" George was lapping up the port in a sort of golden reverie. "Don't do it, George," I said, loudly enough, I hoped, to blast him out of his complacency. "Well, don't be a judge." "Don't get married." "Oh, look, George, Your Honour, if your lordship pleases, have a little consideration, my dear boy." I tried to appeal to his better nature. "I mean, where would you be leaving me?" "Oh, very much as you are now, I should imagine." "Those peaceful moments of the day, those hours we spend with a bottle of Chateau Fleet Street from 5:30 on in Pomeroy's wine bar. That wonderful oasis of peace that lies between the Battle of the Bailey and the horrors of home life. You mean they'll be denied to me from now on? You mean you'll be bolting like a rabbit down the Temple Underground back to Mrs. Tempest and leaving me without a companion?" George looked at me thoughtfully and then gave judgment with, I thought, a certain lack of feeling. "Well, I am, of course, extremely fond of you, Rumpole, but you're not exactly, not someone who can share all one's interests with." "Don't do it, George. Marriage is like pleading guilty for an indefinite sentence, without parole." I poured more port. "You're exaggerating." "I'm not, George, I swear by Almighty God I'm not." I gave him the facts. "Do you know what happens on Saturday mornings, when free men are lying in bed or wandering contentedly towards a glass of breakfast Chablis and a slow read of the obituaries? You'll both set out with a list, and your lady wife will spend your hard-earned money on things you have no desire to own, like vim and saucepan scourers and jay-cloths and mansion polish. And on your way home you'll be asked to carry the shopping basket. Oh, I beg of you, don't do it." This plea to the jury might have had some effect, but the door then opened to admit La Belle Tempest. George's eyes glazed over, and he clearly became deaf to reason. And then Hilda entered and gave me a brisk order to bring in the coffee-tray. "She who must be obeyed," I whispered to George on my way out. "Do you see what I mean, George?" I might as well have saved my breath. He wasn't listening. On the following Monday, I went down to Dockside Magistrates' Court to defend young Jim Timpson on a charge of taking and driving away a Ford Cortina. I have acted for various members of the clan Timpson, a noted breed of South London villains, for many years. They know the law, and their courtroom behaviour, I mean the way they stand to attention and call the magistrate sir, is impeccable. I went into battle fiercely that afternoon, and it was a famous victory. We got the summons dismissed, with costs against the police. I hoped I'd achieve the same happy result in the notable trial of the Reverend Mordred Skinner, but I very much doubted it. As soon as I was back in chambers, I opened a cupboard, sneezed in the resulting cloud of dust, and burrowed in the archives. I lingered briefly on a book of old press cuttings from the news of the world. that fine legal textbook in the criminal jurisdiction, and merely glanced at the analysis of bloodstains from the old Brick Lane billiard-hall murder, when I was locked in single-handed combat with the former Lord Chief Justice of England, and secured an acquittal, and came at last on what I was seeking. The blue folder of photographs was nestling under an old wig tin and an outdated work on forensic medicine. As I dug out my treasure and carried it to the light on my desk, I muttered a few lines of old William Wordsworth's The Sheep of the Lake District. Perhaps the plaintive numbers flow for old unhappy far-off things and battles long ago. On the cover of the photographs I'd stuck a yellowed cutting from the Ramsgate Times. Couple charged in local arson case. I read again. The unexplained destruction of the Saracen's Head Hotel. I opened the folder. There was a picture of a building on the seafront, and a number of people standing around. I took the strong glass off my desk to examine the figures in the photograph, and saw the younger but still roguishly smiling face of Mrs. Ida Tempest, my friend George's intended. Having tucked the photographs back in the archive, I went straight to Pomeroy's wine bar. Nothing unusual about that. I rarely go anywhere else at 6 o'clock, after the day's work is done. But George wasn't in chambers, and I hoped he might drop in there for a strengthener before a night of dalliance with his inamorata at the Royal Borough Hotel. However, when I got to Pomeroy's, the only recognisable figure, apart from a few mournful-looking journalists and the opera critic in residence, was our Portia, Miss Phillida Trant, drinking a lonely Cinzano Bianco with ice and lemon. She told me she hadn't seen George, and said rather enigmatically that she was waiting for a person called Claude, who on further inquiry turned out to be none other than our elegant expert on the civil side, my learned antagonist Erskine Brown. Good God, is he Claude? Makes me feel quite fond of him. Why ever are you waiting for him? Do you want to pick his brains on the law of mortgages? We are, by way of being engaged, Miss Trant said somewhat sharply. Infection seemed to be spreading in our chambers like jippy tummy. I looked at Miss Trant and asked, simply for information, You sure you know enough about him? I'm afraid I do. She sounded resigned. I mean, you'd naturally want to know everything, wouldn't you? About anyone you're going to commit matrimony with? I wanted her confirmation. Go on, surprise me. Miss Trant, I had the feeling, was not being entirely serious. He married a middle-aged Persian contortionist when he was up at Keble. Oh, I'd love to know that. It'd make him far more exciting. At which point the beloved Claude actually made his appearance in a bowler and overcoat with a velvet collar, and announced he had some treat in store for Miss Trant, such as Verdi's Requiem in the Festival Hall, while she looked at him as though disappointed at the unmurkiness of the Erskine-Brown past. And then I saw George at the counter making a small purchase from Jack Pomeroy, and I bore down on him. I had no doubt at that stage that my simple duty to my old friend was immediate disclosure. However, when I reached George, I found that he was investing in a bottle far removed from our usual Chateau Fleet Street. Oh, 1967 Pichon Longueville. Celebrating, George? Yes, in a way. We have a glass or two in the room now. Can't get anything decent in the restaurant. George was storing the nectar away in his briefcase with the air of a practised boulevardier. George, look, my dear fellow, look, will you have a drink? It's really much more comfortable up in the room, George babbled on regardless. And we listen to the BBC Overseas Service, old Victor Sylvester records requested from Nigeria. They only seem to care for ballroom dancing in the third world nowadays. My old friend was moving away from me, although I did all I could to stop him. Please, George, it'll only take a minute. Look, something you really ought to know. Sorry to desert you, Rumpole. It'd never do to keep Ida waiting. And he was gone, as Jack Pomeroy, with his purple face and the rosebud in his buttonhole, asked what was my pleasure. Red plonk, I told him, Chateau Fleet Street, a large glass. I've got nothing to celebrate. After that I found it increasingly difficult to break the news to George, although I knew I had to do so. The Reverend Mordred Skinner was duly sent for trial at the Inner London Sessions, Newington Causeway, in the south-east corner of London. Wherever civilization ends, it is, I've always felt, somewhere just north of the Inner London Sessions. It's a strange thing, but I always look forward with a certain eagerness to an appearance at the Old Bailey. I walk down Newgate Street as often as not with a spring in my stride, and there it is in all its glory. A stately law court decreed by the city fathers, an Edwardian palace with a modern extension to deal with the increase in human fallibility. Terrible things go on down the Bailey. Horrifying things. Why is it I never go through its revolving door without a thrill of pleasure, a slight tremble of excitement? Why does it seem a much jollier place than my flat in Gloucester Road under the strict rule of she who must be obeyed? But such pleasurable sensations, I must confess, are never connected with my visits to the Inner London Sessions. While a hint of spring sunshine often touches the figure of justice on the dome of the Bailey, it always seems to be a wet Monday in November at Inner London. The Sessions House is stuck in a sort of urban desert down the Old Kent Road, with nowhere to go for a decent bit of steak and kidney pud during the lunch hour. It's a sad sort of court, with all the cheeky cockney sparrows turned into silent figures waiting for the burglary to come on in court too. And the juries there look as if they relied on the work to eke out their social security. I met the reverend gentleman after I had donned the formal dress. Yellowing wig, bought second-hand from an ex-Attorney General of Tonga in 1932. Somewhat frayed gown, collar like a blunt extension. He seemed unconcerned and was even smiling a little, although his sister Evelyn looked like one about to attend a burning at the stake. Mr. Morse looked thoroughly uncomfortable, and as if he'd like to get back to a nice discussion of the almshouse charity in Chipping Sodbury. I tried to instill a suitable sense of the solemnity of the occasion in my clerical customer by telling him that God, with that wonderful talent for practical joking which has shown itself throughout recorded history, had dealt us his honour Judge Bullingham. "Is he very dreadful?" Mr. Skinner asked, almost hopefully. Why he was ever made a judge is one of the unsolved mysteries of the universe. I was determined not to sound reassuring. I can only suppose that his unreasoning prejudice against all black persons, defence lawyers, and probation officers comes from some deep psychological cause. Perhaps his mother, if such a person can be imagined, was once assaulted by a black probation officer who was on his way to give evidence for the defence. I wonder how he feels about parsons. My client seemed not at all put out. Oh, God knows, I rather doubt if he's ever met one. The bull's leisure taste runs to strong drink and all in wrestling. Come along, we might as well enter the corrida. A couple of hours later, His Honour Judge Bullingham, with his thick neck and complexion of a beetroot past its first youth, was calmly exploring his inner ear with his little finger, and tolerantly allowing me to cross-examine a large gentleman named Pratt, resident Flatfoot at the Oxford Street Bazaar. "Mr. Pratt, how long have you been a detective in this particular store?" 10 years, sir." "And before that?" "I was with the Metropolitan Police." "Why did you leave?" "Pay and conditions, sir, were hardly satisfactory." "Oh, really? You found it more profitable to keep your beady eye on the ladies' lingerie counter than to do battle in the streets with serious crime?" "Are you suggesting that this isn't a serious crime, Mr. Rumpole?" The learned judge, who pots villains with all the subtlety of his namesake animal, charging a gate, growled this question at me with his face going a darker purple than ever, and his jowls trembling. "For many people, my lord," I turned to the jury and gave them the message, "6 shirts might be a mere triviality. For the Reverend Mordred Skinner, they represent the possibility of total ruin, disgrace, and disaster. In this case, my client's whole life hangs in the balance." I turned a flattering gaze on the 12 honest citizens who had been chosen to pronounce on the sanctity or otherwise of the Reverend Mordred. That is why we must cling to our most cherished institution, trial by jury. It is not the value of the property stolen. It is the priceless matter of a man's good reputation.
"Mr. Rumpole." The bull lifted his head as if for the charge. "You should know your business by now. This is not the time for making speeches. You will have an opportunity at the end of the case."
"And as your honour will have an opportunity after me to make a speech, I thought it well to make clear who the judges of fact in this matter are." I continued to look at the jury with an expression of flattering devotion.
"Yes, very well, get on with it."
The bull retreated momentarily. I rubbed in the victory. Certainly that is what I was attempting to do. I turned to the witness. "Mr. Pratt, when you were in the gents' haberdashery—"
"Yes, sir."
"You didn't see my client remove the shirts from the counter and make off with them?"
"No, sir." "If he had, no doubt he would have told us about it."
Bullingham could not resist growling. I gave him a little bow. "Your honour is always so quick to notice points in favour of the defence." I went back to work on the store detective. "So why did you follow my client?"
"The supervisor noticed a pile of shirts missing. She said there was a reverend been turning them over, your honour."
This titbit delighted the bull, who snatched at it greedily.
"He might not have told us that if you hadn't asked the wrong question, Mr. Rumpole."
"No question is wrong if it reveals the truth," I informed the jury, and then turned back to Pratt. I had an idea, an uncomfortable feeling, that I might just have guessed the truth of this peculiar case. "So you don't know if he was carrying the shopping basket when he left the shirt department?"
"No."
"Was he carrying it when you first spotted him on the moving staircase?"
I only saw his head and shoulders."
The pieces were fitting together. I would have to face my client with my growing notion of a defence as soon as possible. "So you first saw him, with the basket, in the hall of food?"
"That's right, sir."
At which point Bullingham stirred dangerously and raised the curtain of his top lip on some large yellowing teeth. He was about to make a joke.
"Are you suggesting, Mr. Rumpole, that a basket full of shirts mysteriously materialized in your client's hand in the tinned meat department?"
At which the jury laughed obsequiously. Rumpole silenced them in a voice of enormous gravity. "Might I remind your honour of what he said? This is a serious case."
"As you cross-examined Mr. Rumpole, I was beginning to wonder."
Bullingham was still grinning. "The art of cross-examination, your honour, is a little like walking a tightrope."
"Oh, is it?"
"Yes, one gets on so much better if one isn't continually interrupted." At which Bullingham relapsed into a sullen silence, and I got on with the work in hand. "It would have been quite impossible for Mr. Skinner to have paid at the shirt counter, wouldn't it?"
"No, sir. There were 2 assistants behind the counter."
"Young ladies?"
"Yes, sir."
"When you saw them, what were they doing?"
I can't exactly recall."
"Well, then, let me jog your memory." Here I made an informed guess at what any 2 young lady assistants would be doing at the height of business during the summer sales. Were they not huddled together in an act of total recall of last night in the disco or Palais de Hop? Were they not blind and deaf to the cries of shirt-buying clerics? Were they not utterly oblivious to the life around them? The jury was looking at me and smiling, and some of the ladies nodded understandingly. I could feel that the old darlings knew all about young lady non-assistants in Oxford Street. "Well, Mr. Pratt, isn't that exactly what they were doing?"
"It may have been, your honour."
"So is it surprising that my client took his purchase and went off in search of some more attentive assistance?"
"But I followed him downstairs into the hall of food."
"Have you any reason to suppose he wouldn't have paid for his shirts there, given the slightest opportunity?"
"I saw no sign of his attempting to do so."
"Just as you saw no sign of the sales-ladies attempting to take his money?"
"No, but—"
"It's a risky business entering your store, isn't it, Pratt?" I put it to him. "You can't get served, and no one speaks to you except to tell you that you're under arrest." I sat down to some smiles from the jury and a glance from the bull. An eager young man named Ken Rydell was prosecuting. I had run up against this Rydell, a ginger-haired, bespectacled wonder who might once have been a senior scout and won the Duke of Edinburgh Award for being left out on the mountainside for a week. Ken felt a strong sense of team spirit and loyalty to the Metropolitan Police, and he was as keen as mustard to add the Reverend Mordred Skinner to the notches on his woggle. "Did you see Mr. Skinner make any attempt to pay for his shirts in the Hall of Food?" Ken asked Pratt. I read a note from my client that had finally arrived by way of the usher. No, I didn't," said Pratt. Ken was smiling, about to make a little scout-like funny. "He didn't ask for them to be wrapped up with a pound of ham, for instance?" "No, sir." Pratt laughed and looked round the court to see that no one else was laughing, and the bull was glaring at Ken.
"This is not a music hall, Mr. Rydell. As Mr. Rumpole has reminded us, this is an extremely serious case. The whole of the reverend gentleman's future is at stake."
The judge glanced at the clock as if daring it not to be time for lunch. The clock cooperated, and the bull rose, muttering,
2:10, members of the jury.
I crumpled my client's note with some disgust and threw it on the floor as I stood to bow to the bull. The Reverend Mordred had just told me he wasn't prepared to give evidence in his own defence. I would have to get him on his own and twist his arm a little. "I simply couldn't take the oath," he told me later. "What's the matter with you? Have you no religion?" The cleric smiled politely and said, less as a question than a statement of fact, "You don't like me very much, do you?" We were sitting in one of the brighter hostelries in Newington Causeway. The bleak and sour-smelling saloon-bar was sparsely populated by 2 ailing cleaning ladies drinking stout, another senior citizen who was smoking the dog-ends he kept in an old OXO tin and exercising his talent as a coffer for England, and a large drunk in a woolly bobble hat who kept banging in and out of the gents with an expression of increasing euphoria. I had entrusted to Mr. Morse, the solicitor, the tricky task of taking Miss Evelyn Skinner to lunch in the public canteen at the Sessions House. I imagined he'd get the full blast of her anxiety over the grey, unidentifiable meat and 2 veg. Meanwhile, I had whisked the Reverend out to the pub, where he sat with the intolerably matey expression vicars always assume in licensed premises. "I felt you might tell me the truth. You, of all people. Having a collar on back to front must mean something." "Truth is often dangerous. It must be approached cautiously, don't you think?" My client bit nervously into a singularly unattractive sausage. I tried to approach the matter cautiously. "I've noticed with women," I told him. "With my wife, for instance, when we go out on our dreaded Saturday morning shopping expeditions, that she who must be obeyed is in charge of the shopping basket. She makes the big decisions, how much vim goes in it and so forth. When the shopping's bought, I get the job of carrying the damn thing home. Simple faith is far more important than the constant scramble after unimportant facts." Mordred was back on the old theology. "I believe that's what the Lives of the Saints tells us." Enough of this cathedral gossip. We were due back in court in half an hour, and I let him have it between the eyes. "Well, my simple faith tells me that your sister had the basket in the shirt department." "Oh, does it?" He blinked most of the time, but not then. "When Pratt saw you in the Hall of Food, you were carrying the shopping basket, which she'd handed to you on the escalator." Perhaps. Because she had taken the shirts and put them in the bag when you were too busy composing your sermon on the problem of evil to notice." I lit a small cigar at that point, and Mordred took a sip of sour bitter. He was still smiling as he started to talk, almost shyly at first, and then with increasing confidence. "She was a pretty child. It's difficult to believe it now. She was always attracted to bright things, boiled sweet, red apples, jewellery and Woolworths. As she grew older, it became worse. She would take things she couldn't possibly need. Spectacles, bead handbags, cigarette cases, although she never smoked. She was like a magpie. I thought she'd improved. I try to watch her as much as I can, although you're right. On that day I was involved with my sermon. As a matter of fact, I had no need of such shirts. I may be old-fashioned, but I always wear a dog collar, always. Even on rambles with the lads' brigade. All the same, my client said firmly, I believe she did it out of love. Well, now we had a defence, although he didn't seem to be totally aware of it. Those are the facts. They seem to be of no interest to anyone, except my immediate family. But that's what I'm bound to say, if I take my oath on the Bible. But you were prepared to lie to me, I reminded him. He smiled again, that small, maddening smile. Mr. Rumpole, I have the greatest respect for your skill as an advocate, but I have never been in danger of mistaking you for Almighty God.
Look, tell the truth now. She'll only get a fine. Nothing.
He seemed to consider the possibility, and then he shook his head. No, to her it would be everything. She couldn't bear it.
Now what about you? You'd give up your whole life.
It seems the least I can do for her. He was smiling again, hanging that patient little grin out like an advertisement for his humility and his deep sense of spiritual superiority to a worldly Old Bailey hack. I ground out my small cigar in the overflowing ashtray and almost shouted, Good God, I don't know how I keep my temper. Yes, I do sympathize. He found his ideas irritated people dreadfully, particularly lawyers. He was almost laughing now. But you do understand, I'm quite unable to give evidence on oath to the jury. As every criminal lawyer knows, it's very difficult to get a client off unless he's prepared to take the trouble of going into the witness box, to face up to the prosecution and to demonstrate his innocence, or at least his credentials, as a fairly likeable character who might buy you a pint after work, and whom you would not really want to see festering in the nick. After all, fair's fair. The jury have just seen the prosecution witnesses put through it, so why should the prisoner at the bar sit in solemn silence in the dock? I knew that if the Reverend told his story with suitable modesty and regret, I could get him off, and Evelyn would merely get a well-earned talking to. When he refused to give evidence, I could almost hear the rustle of unfrocking in the distance. Short of having my client dragged to the Bible by a sturdy usher, when he would no doubt stand mute of malice, there was nothing I could do other than address the jury, in the unlikely hope of persuading them that there was no reliable evidence on which they could possibly convict the silent vicar. I was warming to my work as Bullingham sat inert, breathing hoarsely, apparently about to erupt. Members of the jury, I told them, there is a golden thread that runs throughout British justice. The prosecution must prove its case. The defence has to prove nothing.
Mr. Rumpole.
The sound came from the judge like the first rumble they once heard from Mount Vesuvius. I soldiered on. The Reverend Mordred Skinner need not trouble to move 4 yards from that dock to the witness box unless the prosecution has produced evidence that he intended to steal and not to pay in another department.
Mr. Rumpole.
The earth tremor grew louder. I raised my voice a semitone. Never let it be said that a man is forced to prove his innocence. Our fathers have defied kings for that principle, members of the jury. They forced King John to sign Magna Carta, and sent King Charles to the scaffold, and it has been handed down even to the Inner London Sessions, Newington Causeway.
If you let me get a word in edgeways.
And now it is in your trust. I'm not, as this narrative may have made clear, a religious man. But what happened next made me realize how the Israelites felt when the waters divided, and understand the incredulous reaction of the disciples when an uninteresting glass of water flushed darkly and smelt of the grape. I can recall the exact words of the indubitable miracle. Bullingham said,
Mr. Rumpole, I entirely agree with everything you say.
And, he added, glowering threateningly at the scout for the prosecution,
I shall direct the jury accordingly.
The natural malice of the bull had been quelled by his instinctive respect for the law. He found that there was no case to answer. I met my liberated client in the Gents, a place where his sister was unable to follow him. As we stood side by side at the Porcelain, I congratulated him. Oh, I was quite reconciled to losing. I don't think my sister would have stood by me somehow. The disgrace, you see. I think, he looked almost wistful, I think I should have been alone. You'd have been unfrocked. It might have been extremely restful, not to have to pretend to any sort of sanctity, not to pretend to be different, to be exactly the same as everybody else. I looked at him standing there in the London Sessions loo, his mac over his arm, his thin neck half strangled by a dog collar. He longed for the relaxed life of an ordinary sinner, but he had no right to it. Don't long for a life of crime, old darling, I told him. You've obviously got no talent for it. Upstairs we met Evelyn and Mr. Morse. The sister gave me a flicker of something which might have been a smile of gratitude. It was a miracle, I told her. Really? I thought the judge was exceedingly fair. Come along, Mordred. He's somewhere else, you know, Mr. Rumpole. He can't even realize it's all over. She attacked her brother again. Better put your mac on, dear. It's raining outside. Yes, Evelyn, yes, I'll put it on. He did so obediently. You must come to tea in the rectory, Mr. Rumpole. I had a final chilly smile from Evelyn. Alas, dear lady, the pressure of work. These days I have so little time for pleasure. Say good-bye to Mr. Rumpole, Mordred. The cleric shook my hand and gave me a confidential aside. Good-bye, Mr. Rumpole. You see, it was entirely a family matter. There was no need for anyone to know anything about it. And so he went, in his sister's charge, back to the isolation of the rectory. Will no one tell me what she sings? Perhaps the plaintive numbers flow for old unhappy far-off things, and murders long ago. Had I, against all the odds, learned something from the Reverend? Was I now more conscious of the value of secrecy, of not dropping bombs of information which might cause ruin and havoc on the family front? It seems unlikely, but I do not know why else I was busily destroying the archive, pushing the photographs into the unused fireplace in my chambers and applying a match, and dropping the durable articles, including the ostrich egg, into the waste paper basket. As the flames licked across the paper and set Mrs. Tempest, the arsonist, curling into ashy oblivion, the door opened to admit Miss Trant. "Rumpole, what on earth are you doing?" I turned from the smoking relics. "You keep things, Miss Trant? Mementos, locks of hair, old letters tied up in ribbon. Memories," I started to sing tunelessly, "were made of this." "No, not really." "Good." "Oh, but I've kept my first brief, from when I prosecuted you in Dock Street." This was the occasion when I tricked Miss Trant into boring the wretched beak with a huge pile of law, and so defeated her. It was not an incident of which I am particularly proud. "Destroy it. Forget the past, Miss Trant? Look to the future." "Yes, all right. Aren't you coming up to Guthrie Featherston's room? We're laying on a few drinks for George." "George? Oh, yes, of course. He'll have a lot to celebrate." Guthrie Featherston, QC MP, the suave and elegant Conservative Labour MP for somewhere or another, who, when he's not passing the gas mains enabling bill or losing politely at golf to various of Her Majesty's judges, condescends to exercise his duties as head of chambers, a post to which I was due to succeed by order or seniority of barristers in practice, when I was pipped at the post by young Guthrie taking silk. Well, I didn't want it anyway. Guthrie Featherston occupied the best room in chambers, and he was engaged in making a speech to our assembled members. In a corner of the room I saw our clerk Henry and Diane, the typist, in charge of a table decorated by several bottles of Jack Pomeroy's cooking champagne. I made straight for the booze, and at first Featherston's speech seemed but a background noise like Radio 4. "It's well known among lawyers that the finest advocates never make the best judges.
The glory of the advocate is to be opinionated, brash, fearless, partisan, hectoring, rude, cunning, and unfair. Ha ha! Well done, Rumpole. This, of course, was Erskine Brown. Thank you very much, Claude. I raised my glass to him. The ideal judge, however, Featherstone babbled on, is detached, courteous, patient, painstaking, and above all, quiet. These qualities are to be found personified in the latest addition to our bench of circuit judges. Circus judges, Rumpole calls them, Uncle Tom said loudly to no one in particular. Ladies and gentlemen, the QCMP concluded, please raise your glasses to His Honour Judge George Frobisher. Everyone was smiling and drinking. So the news had broken. George was a circuit judge. No doubt the crowds were dancing in Fleet Street. I moved to my old friend to add my word of congratulation. Your health, George. Coupled with the name of Mrs. Ida Tempest. No, Rumpole. No. George shook his head, I thought sadly. What do you mean, no? Mrs. Tempest should be here to share in your triumph. Celebrating back at the Royal Borough Hotel, is she? She'll have the moe on ice by the time we get back. Mrs. Tempest left the Royal Borough last week, Rumpole. I have no means of knowing where to find her. At which point we were rudely interrupted by Guthrie Featherstone calling on George to make a speech. Other members joined in, and Henry filled up George's glass in preparation for the great oration. I'm totally unprepared to say anything on this occasion, George said, taking a piece of paper from his pocket to general laughter. Poor old George could never do anything off the cuff. Ladies and gentlemen, George started, I have long felt the need to retire from the hurly-burly of practice at the bar. It comes as news to me that George Frobisher had a practice at the bar, Uncle Tom said to no one, much in a deafening whisper. To escape from the benevolent despotism of Henry, now our senior clerk, George twinkled. Can you do a careless driving at Croydon tomorrow, Your Honour? Henry called out in the cheeky manner he had adopted since he was an office boy. Laughter. No, Henry, I can't. So I have long considered applying for a circuit judgeship in a rural area. Where are you going to, George? Glorious Devon? Featherstone interrupted. I think they're starting me off in Luton, and I hope very soon I'll have the pleasure of you all appearing before me. And naturally, as a judge, as one, however humble, of Her Majesty's judges, certain standards will be expected of me, and I mean to try to do my best to live up to those standards, said George. That's really all I have to say. Thank you. Thank you all very much. There was tumultuous applause, increased in volume by the cooking champagne, and George joined me in a corner of the room. George, I'm sorry about Mrs. Tempest. It was your fault, Rumpole. George looked at me with an air of severe rebuke. My fault? I stood amazed, but I said nothing. Not a word. Now, you know me, George. Discretion is Rumpole's middle name. I was silent as the tomb. When I brought her to dinner with you and Hilda, she recognized you at once. Well, I said, she didn't show it. Ah, well, she's a remarkable woman. I was junior counsel for her former husband. I'm sure he led her on. She made an excellent impression, George, in the witness box. I tried to sound comforting. She made an excellent impression on me, Rumpole. She thought that you would be bound to tell me. She thought that. So she decided to tell me first. I stood looking at George, feeling unreasonably guilty. Somewhere in the distance Uncle Tom was going through the usual form of words. As I remember, Ida Tempest got 3 years, I said. Yes, said George. Her former husband got 7. I was trying to cheer him up. I don't believe Ida actually applied the match. All the same, Rumpole, it was a risk I didn't feel able to take. You didn't notice the smell of burning, did you, George, any night in the Royal Borough Hotel? Of course not. But the Lord Chancellor's secretary
had just told me of my appointment. It doesn't do for a judge's wife to have done 3 years, even with full remission. I looked at George. Was the sacrifice, I wondered, really necessary?
Did you have to be a judge, George?
I thought of that, of course, but I had the appointment. You know, at my age, Rumpole, it's difficult to learn any new sort of trade. I filled George's glass.
Oh, drink up, George. There may be other ladies turning up at the Royal Borough Hotel.
I very much doubt it, he replied. Every night when I sit at the table for one, I shall think, if only I'd never taken her to dinner at Rumpole's. Then I might never have known, don't you see? We could have been perfectly happy together. Sometimes I feel it will be difficult to forgive you, Rumpole, George said, very quietly.
George, what did I do? I protested. I didn't say anything.
But it wasn't true. My mere existence had been enough to deny George his happiness. At which point Uncle Tom finished his speech, and the other barristers raised their glasses to George and started to sing for He's a Jolly Good Fellow. I left them and went out into the silence of the temple, where I could still hear them singing. Next Saturday morning I was acting the part of the native bearer with the vim basket, following She Who Must Be Obeyed through the supermarket undergrowth on our ritual shopping expedition. They've never made George Frobisher a judge. My wife seemed to feel it an occasion for ridicule and contempt. In my view, an excellent appointment, I said. I should expect to have a good record of acquittals in the Luton Crown Court. When are they going to make you a judge, Rumpole? Oh, don't ask silly questions. I'd start every sentence with, there, but for the grace of God, goes Horace Rumpole. Oh, I can imagine what she's feeling like, Hilda sniffed. She? The cat that swallowed the cream. Her Honour, Mrs. Judge, Mrs. Ida Tempest, still thinks she's quite the thing, I'll be bound. No, she's gone, I said. Gone, Rumpole? What did George say about that? Cried, and the world cried too. Ours the treasure. Suddenly, as rare things will, she vanished. We climbed on a bus, heavily laden, back to Casa Rumpole. George is well out of it. He wants my opinion. Oh, well, I don't think he does. What? Want your opinion. Later, in our kitchen, as she stored the vim away under the sink and I prepared our Saturday morning G&T, a thought occurred to me. Do you know, I'm not sure I should have taken up as a lawyer. Whatever do you mean? Or perhaps I should have taken up as a vicar. Rumpole, have you been getting at the gin already? Faith, not facts, is what we need, do you think? Hilda was busy unpacking the saucepan scars. Perhaps she didn't quite get my drift. George Frobisher has always been a bad influence, keeping me out drinking, she said. Let's hope I'll be seeing more of you now he's been made a judge. I'd never have to know all these facts about people if I hadn't set up as a lawyer. Of course you should have been a lawyer, Rumpole. Why, exactly? Well, if you hadn't set up as a lawyer, if you hadn't gone into Daddy's chambers, you'd never have met me, Rumpole. I looked at her, suddenly seeing great vistas of what my life might have been. That's true, I said. Damn it, that's very true. Put the gumption away for me, will you, Rumpole? She Who Must Be Obeyed. Of course, I did.